To the debate. Our focus today is on, well, one of the most provocative and yet conceptually precise claims from the material we've been looking at. This assertion that social media is making people dumber. And I want to be clear, this isn't just some simple generational lament. It's a real critique of cognitive function being shaped by digital architecture.
Right. And I think to engage with that claim productively, we have to immediately clarify what we even mean by dumber. The central disagreement we're facing here is, I think, pretty fundamental. Is the decline in these observed cognitive skills, and I do want to emphasize skills, these trained abilities, is it primarily the result of a structural design that's just ruthlessly built to extract attention? Or is it more of a predictable, but ultimately reversible, human biological response to this wave of informational abundance?
My core belief here is that the environment itself is the primary vector of erosion. I mean, the very structures of these platforms, the design, the algorithms, they actively reward shallowness and speed and, immediate emotional reaction. This mechanism, it systematically dismantles the cognitive capacities that intelligence really depends on. We're talking about sustained attention, complex logical reasoning, and just the ability to pause and reflect before you act. We are being actively detrained, and it's by design.
I come at the problem from a slightly different angle. While I absolutely acknowledge the immense power of that environmental shaping, my focus is more on the underlying biological mechanism, the exploitation of our deep-seated reward systems, the ones tied to dopamine. The human brain remains wonderfully plastic. And so what was trained out of us by these algorithmic systems, our capacity for deep work, for patience, it can, with intentional, deliberate effort, be trained back in. The damage isn't permanent, but, and this is a huge but, the effort required to resist a multi-billion-dollar system that is built against your focus is, well, it's truly immense.
Okay, but before we get too deep into the mechanisms, we absolutely have to pause and define what the material means by dumber. I think that's critical, otherwise we risk just falling into a defensive trap. It's so important to understand that this is not about a lower IQ, and it's not about reducing intellectual potential.
Exactly.
The material defines this decline as the systemic erosion of trained, functional, cognitive abilities. So we're talking about the inability to sustain attention on complex subjects, the decay of critical thinking when you're faced with conflicting data, the abandonment of logical reasoning for emotional shortcuts, and maybe most crucially, the failure to reflect before you hit send. Intelligence isn't the quantity of information we have, it's the ability to process that information deeply and synthesize it into real understanding. The material makes a really strong case that informational abundance, that constant, rapid, unfiltered, algorithmically curated fire hose of data, it actively kills genuine understanding. Our brains, they evolved to handle scarcity, to seek patterns in sparse environments. So when they're faced with saturation, this evolutionary mismatch forces the brain to become purely reactive, emotionally stimulated, and just perpetually focused on the short-term spike. The system actively punishes the things deep thought requires: stillness, cognitive strain, and delayed gratification.
That is a profound thought, especially that concept of an evolutionary mismatch. But I would frame the decline a little differently. While the environment is saturated, I think the primary culprit isn't just the sheer volume. It's the platform's optimization engine. Social media isn't a passive library, right? It functions as an attention extraction machine. And it's designed not just to occupy time, but to aggressively shape and monetize very specific behaviors. This is where I'd introduce the concept of the algorithmic brain. Your attention is no longer a self-directed beam of mental energy. It's algorithmically guided. It's been trained to follow the next emotional spike or the next variable reward. And crucially, we have to understand the role of dopamine here. The source material reminds us that dopamine is anticipation, not pleasure. And platforms exploit this with variable reward loops. Every single scroll, every notification, every time you pull to refresh a feed, it's basically a slot machine. It's training the brain to seek constant novelty and, critically, to avoid the high cognitive effort required for real learning. The result is what the material calls an addiction without intoxication, where the user is still functional, but their mind has been systematically trained to just reject the mental discipline needed for deep, sustained work.
I see why you think that, and I do agree on the addictive mechanism, but let's press on the profound consequence that this training has on our internal operating system. If intelligence is some vast, complex building, then attention is its absolute foundation. My assertion is that the cognitive damage we see comes from this constant, minute-by-minute erosion. The infinite scroll, the incessant notifications, the autoplay videos, rather than some single catastrophic trauma. The material suggests this constant fracturing leads to a profound internal shift. Deep thinking doesn't just feel difficult, it feels fundamentally uncomfortable, almost wrong. Think about that physical feeling of resistance you get when you switch from a rapidly updating feed to, say, reading a 50-page academic paper or wrestling with a novel. The brain has been neurologically conditioned to expect novelty every few seconds and resolution without patience. So when it's faced with complexity that requires stillness and cognitive strain, the brain just rebels. It's expecting that instant dopamine hit. And when that reward doesn't arrive in milliseconds, the activity is rejected as intolerably frustrating. The erosion is silent, but that discomfort is a very real, measurable rejection of our reasoning capacity.
That's a compelling argument that frames the resistance perfectly. But let's look at the foundational cost of that friction, which I believe is the death of boredom. If attention is the foundation, then boredom was the vital, quiet, internal space where true intellectual growth happened. I mean, boredom used to be the brain's dark room, where reflection occurred, where imagination was given free rein, and where the brain consolidated all these disparate ideas into meaningful connections. But if every gap is filled immediately, if every moment of stillness is interrupted by an urgent, algorithmically optimized prompt, a new photo, or breaking alert, the brain never learns how to rest deeply or how to wrestle with genuine difficulty. The consequence is what the material calls shallow fluency. We collect more headlines, we recognize more terms, we have a high familiarity with subjects, but we understand, well, almost nothing deeply. This familiarity, which is so dangerously mistaken for true mastery, that's the core cognitive failure of this environment.
But the discomfort that points directly to a trained and therefore a structural inability to engage with depth. The brain has been, in a sense, disabled from performing deep processing because of this dopamine desensitization from constant novelty seeking. This moves beyond a simple choice to ignore depths. It becomes a trained physiological preference for stimulation without effort. And this presents an enormous, often insurmountable challenge to our educational systems, which are fundamentally built on the premise that students can embrace and sustain focus under cognitive strain. We're asking people to perform intellectual tasks that their daily environment actively trains them to find physically and emotionally painful.
And that dynamic, the pain of focus, it transitions us perfectly to the next critical shift. The move from genuine thinking to mere reacting. And I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the structural discomfort is the only active agent here. Let me tell you why. The algorithmic system actively trains reaction over reasoning, precisely because the platforms reward speed, emotional certainty, and immediate response over accuracy, patience, and nuance. The environment has completely collapsed the cognitive cost of having an opinion. If I sound confident, if I sound emotional, and if I'm quick, I get rewarded with engagement, regardless of whether my statement is thoughtful or even true. This is where the dangerous illusion of knowledge just accelerates. We stitch together fragments of headlines and summaries, and we assume we've achieved understanding. The result is supreme confidence without the underlying competence. Thinking stops being a reflective internal process and becomes an instant public performance.
I would frame the consequence of that speed differently, though I do agree with the diagnosis of rewarding reaction. The deeper, more insidious problem is that opinions stop being conclusions reached through diligent reasoning and instead become transactional identity signals. The fundamental thought process shifts from the objective and demanding what is true based on the evidence to the tribal and comforting what does my group believe and how can I signal my loyalty. The system is engineered to quickly collapse complexity into binary, emotionally charged thinking, us versus them, absolute good versus absolute evil. because nuance requires cognitive patience, and it can't be compressed into the sound bites the platform demands. Once an idea is morally framed, questioning it feels like a betrayal of the group. Disagreement switches the brain from its analytical reasoning mode into threat response mode, effectively using moral certainty as a substitute for actual rigorous thought.
Disagreement switches the brain from its analytical reasoning mode into threat response mode, effectively using moral certainty as a substitute for actual rigorous thought. I'm not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning, because while tribal signaling is certainly a destructive product, I believe the core driver is still performance linked to the algorithmic reward structure. The environment rewards those who never pause. The structure is built so that certainty, even cruelty, generates higher engagement and spreads faster than curiosity or a nuanced perspective. This leads to the effective outsourcing of thinking itself. Why wrestle with a difficult concept when you can just share an emotionally resonant quote? Why read a 30-page research paper when you can consume a single definitive summary? Thinking becomes curatorial. We gather and display ideas rather than generative, where we develop and struggle with and refine original thought. We're just avoiding the necessary intellectual struggle that true learning and competence demand, trading mastery for mere visibility.
That inability to tolerate struggle, that dependence on outsourcing, is precisely why I argue the problem is systemic. It demands we look at the structure above individual effort. If we accept the definition that intelligence is a sustained practice, the act of focusing, reasoning, patiently pursuing depth, then the modern environment is systematically training people to practice it less, and at a massive scale. The platform's fundamental design incentives are in direct competition with the foundational assumptions of intellectual development, even our entire educational system. Unless there is a fundamental change in the environmental architecture or a massive coordinated user resistance, the trend outlined in the material will continue. Being informed, the efficient curating of ideas, will continue to replace being intelligent, the difficult, necessary process of generating original ideas and understanding. We risk forgetting the crucial difference between the two entirely.
And this brings us right back to the question of agency and the plasticity of the mind. That's a compelling and frankly sobering argument about the scale of the challenge. But have you considered that framing it purely as systemic removes the necessary potential for resistance? The material explicitly states this isn't permanent physiological damage. The circuits are just dormant or detrained. Brains are plastic. What was trained out can and must be trained back in through intentional resistance. The path to reversal is difficult, I'd even say painful, precisely because it involves forcing the brain out of its comfortable, shallow patterns. It requires rebuilding attention by deliberately reintroducing boredom, committing to long-form single-task reading, and rigorously practicing periods of complete digital abstinence. These activities feel acutely uncomfortable because they are training the necessary cognitive strength, the mental discipline the environment sought to dismantle. The focus can't just be on how the platform diminishes us. It has to be on how we can reclaim the necessary gap between thought and public expression.
I agree that intentional resistance is possible for the individual, and it's a moral imperative for anyone who values depth. But we can't escape the structural reality that the cognitive skills of intelligence focus, reasoning, patience, are being quietly and ruthlessly punished by an environment optimized for constant stimulation and instant reward. The pursuit of depth is now inherently the friction-filled, uncomfortable path, and that's a battle against the fundamental design incentives of our digital world.
We need to enforce the discipline of thinking privately before speaking publicly. That gap is where reasoning has the time and space to live, where nuance can be reintroduced, and where we can break free from the performance cycle the algorithms demand of us. The future will inevitably split between those who consume endlessly and passively and those who consciously and rigorously cultivate their attention.
In understanding the precise mechanisms of this cognitive erosion, whether they're rooted in biological exploitation or algorithmic structure, is the first and most critical step to reclaiming intellectual agency in an environment designed to suppress it. Thank you for this necessary and difficult discussion on the nature of digital intelligence.
A profound and critical look at how our technological environments are acting as trainers for our cognition, demanding that we rethink the very meaning of focus and effort.